Hi and welcome to Generous Theology. In this episode, Chuck and Brock examine material from Robert Pasnau's Chapter 26, Science and Certainty, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
What I would say is, first of all, I think it's true that mockery and satire can be used as an offensive weapon, right? It can be used in a way to destroy. I don't know if that is a new thing, that it's only modern or postmodern thinkers who do that. I think we can find some level of that mocking and satire being used as a weapon further back. The fact that it was used before doesn't change the fact that it is a tool that is used today, and we need to pay attention to that and fight against it. There is a sense in which I have found, it seems to me, that in recent years, we're starting to find that satire. And by the way, there's probably a place for satire, but it does have its place. It isn't necessarily as an offensive weapon, sword designed to hack others. But I am concerned that Christians have started to take on the tool of satire and of mockery and begin to use it in very inappropriate ways, really copying the world around us in doing that. And it is concerning to me. As much as it's sometimes fun to see a cartoon or something like that makes the point that sort of agrees with you and makes it in a mocking way, it is really not a proper tool. And I don't know that it really, I don't think that's the way Christians ought to be forwarding their argument, at least for the most part. Again, there may be a place for satire, but I think place for satire is less out and about and making one's point among those with whom we disagree, and more as an internal thing to help us, understand our own foils and our own more as pointing it back at all. So that I think I am seeing that is definitely a concern that it gets used. It's interesting to me is and not so much just about the use of mockery and satire, but there is a sense in which some of the things in this chapter, it's interesting to me that there are some areas where old medieval ways of thinking actually answer some of the concerns that we're having about modern ways of thinking. I'll give an example of that. And it's interesting how it's divided in this chapter. Earlier on in the chapter, and we talked a little bit about Pasnau talks to some extent about Aristotle and the Aristotelian approach, putting knowledge on a sliding scale. So you identify an episteme, what's the best episteme to achieve, and that's where our modern science stems. But then there is this kind of scale that recognizes we're not going to necessarily achieve that ideal, that best epistemic state. And there can be other ways of looking at things where we have perhaps not quite the same level of knowledge. And there I think he was talking more about knowledge, particularly about certainty. And then later, Pasnau talks about certainty and evidence. He says, surprisingly, Aristotle says nothing at all certainty in the period analytic, but by the later Middle Ages, that link between science, scientia, and certainty becomes taken for granted. And we already see this sense in which we have idealized scientific knowledge of a particular type. And in the modern way of thinking, that does tend to be scientific knowledge that can be measured using the scientific method. And we idealize as being the perfect epistemic state, perfect epistemic knowledge that we have. And only that is certainty. And then anything that's outside of that is something that is entirely uncertain. And we don't have any sort of ability to have certainty about those things, so we don't even talk about them. And you and I have talked about this as well, where oftentimes things that are in the transcendental world get ignored, especially by modern science, because they're not the types of things that can be proven using the scientific method. And yet we have this whole system. Aristotle doesn't talk about certainty in the posterior analytics, and perhaps that is related to what we've discussed before, that there is this sliding scale. And obviously Aristotle had this ideal, but an ideal doesn't mean necessarily the be all and end all. Interestingly, as well, as I've learned about the scientific method, I've come to realize that even that in and of itself relies on a little bit of a sliding, right? We treat theories as if they are, in the popular culture, we treat theories as if these are the absolute propositions that nobody can possibly ever disagree with, ever possibly challenge. And yet that's not the way the scientific method is supposed to work. Certainly theories are ideas that have greater evidence behind them, and that we have greater reliance, that we have have epistemic knowledge about these things when they get to the theory level, as opposed to earlier on when they're a hypothesis trying to prove and you're postulating these different ideas, those kinds. But even then, theories are meant to be just that, theory, and always should be somewhat challenged. And yet there are certain areas where it seems very difficult to challenge. And that it shouldn't be easy to challenge all theories, because we do want to have some certainty about things. And if we've done a lot of the work to create systems of thought that seem to make sense in many situations, we shouldn't just easily toss them. On the other hand, there should never be an absolute certainty by which we are no longer willing to ever consider any challenges. And concerns me that on the one hand, there is I think a popular sense doesn't think of it that thinks that things are set in stone and never shall they change. And there is also a tendency, I think, among certain proponents of certain theories and not challenges to those theories, even when those challenges well taken, even in the terms science has set for itself, i.e. the scientific method, those kinds of things. It then also relates, and we talked a little bit about this that relates to questions of faith and how do we know what we know. And it is interesting that there is a tie. These are not things that are completely separate from each other. If we think about the sliding scale of epistemic knowledge, there is a way that we can apply that to ideas of scientific certainty and faith. And those two areas are not so absolutely separate as to be unrelated, but rather there is some relation between them, even if they are not the same thing. We don't necessarily expect a scientific certainty of our faith. We also would not expect a certainty of science.
I love thinking about that because there's a careful qualification that comes out when we're studying these topics. And that really helps with a lot of confusion that people have. What is science? How does it relate to knowledge? And this chapter, like you've pointed out, brings that up so beautifully. One of the things I'm struck with is this idea of science. Now, Robert Grosseteste documents 4 dimensions or 4 modes of scientific knowledge, scientia. The first one is a comprehension of truth. So this is about science being the fact that after encountering reality, our minds can have an understanding of it, comprehension of it. Now, the second thing referred to by Grosseteste is this idea of natural contingencies. And that is the idea that reality is composed of parts that we can analyze and have knowledge about distinctly. So water weighs one amount, has a certain density, has certain chemical properties, whereas another substance, let's say copper or silver, has a different weight, a different color, different chemical properties. And these natural contingencies yet form, in some sense, an absolute unity. So our reality contains a multiplicity of things that are unified. And so these natural contingencies are worthy of being studied in this fashion. Now, related to that is Grosseteste's third category, and this is the idea of comprehension of the truth of things that are always one way. So we use modern language of invariance to refer to these. So think of fundamental truths or timeless truths. And remember back, Chuck, when we were studying the pre-Socratics, you had some of the Greek thinkers said everything was in flux, a state of constant change. Heraclitus, for example, you can't step into the same river twice. And yet there was this view by Parmenides, contrasting view, that was at the very opposite spectrum, which is that all of reality is in fact this invariant. It's this underlying, immutable, fundamentally non-changing thing. And so this third category is trying to work within this idea somehow. What are the main things, the main truths that reality is built out of? And that relates to his fourth idea, the comprehension of what exists immutably. And so we relate that back to that Parmenidean ideal. And when you look at these various dimensions, the lines between physics and metaphysics in the Aristotelian sense, or what we would today call the lines between, let's just say, the phenomenal and the noumenal, really do blur. And it gets hard to tell what is in what category. So, for example, is the study of science itself scientific? There are reasons to think that it might be. It is a critically examined method. People do think about it in many different ways, all trying to come up with these underlying fundamental fundamental immutable truths of reality. And the method that gets us to that is what they're trying to call science. And yet at the same time, how can science measure itself without facing charges of being circular, or without facing the facts that we have to smuggle in or presuppose truths that are beyond demonstration, that are beyond scientific, in order to even first begin the process? And so the medievals set the stage in such a way so as to allow for, and even make in this dominating fashion, as we said earlier, make room for faith. So presumed by these medieval thinkers, for the most part, were not just simply science as a knowledge of objects in reality. For example, botany is the study of flowers. Chemistry is the study of how the periodic elements combine. Astronomy is the study of the celestial objects, but also theology, the study of how God relates to his creation. And then finally, metaphysics itself. And so in the medieval study of science, you have room for metaphysics. And in what comes later, especially in the Kantian sense, when you follow down through in the idea of knowing the thing as it is versus knowing the thing in itself, it's not at all clear that we have room for this in modern conceptions. And changing that changes the whole game. And I wonder, Chuck, is some important aspect of the Christian faith just that very thing, where God shifts within us some principle from maybe thinking of things in very strictly a phenomenal point of view to having a vision that's larger than that. And so we come back to the personal aspects of creation that are so hard to quantify when we're talking in a science context and setting. I rambled there, and I'm not sure I even put it all together, but how would you react to that sort of thing? And how do you square that circle?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the way that you talk about that. And it really reminds me that basic issue of what is science, what is a science, is something that has been struggled with by a lot of thinkers. And there's been discussion of those things over the years. And so when you and I read Reformed Ethics by Bavinck even had a fairly lengthy discussion about where does theology fall within the science and how do we think about theology? Do we think about theology scientifically or in the same way that we talk about other sciences? And I know as well, when we were reading the creative theologians of the early 20th century, that was also something that some of those folks had been thinking about as well. I know that Herman Dooyeweerd considers those kinds of issues as well and was very careful about trying to separate out or at least divide his systematic thinking about philosophy from theology. I think he did that for different reasons. He occasionally gets accused of being very Kantian for that. And there's no doubt that Bavinck and Dooyeweerd have been impacted by post-Kantian way of thinking. On the other hand, I think there was also a sense in Dooyeweerd that he recognized some of his own limitations, that he was not a theologian. He looked to people like Bavinck and others for their insights on things because he recognized he didn't necessarily have all of that background. He was trying to create a way of thinking about systemic structures that would account for theology and faith, but not necessarily subsume it or supersede it. But it is really interesting about how those kinds of questions that both of those folks ask about how do we relate science, how does the study of philosophy and study of theology, how does that relate to this concept of science, a concept that we see Pasnau even describing that has changed significantly during the medieval ages. I think that's an important question. And as much as it sometimes seems like angels dancing on the head of a pin kind of question, it really isn't. It's an important, fundamental, foundational question that we need to think about. I personally, as a Christian, feel like that one of the answers to it is that you cannot ever separate science from religion, science from faith, because all of us are created as faithful, or at least people capable of faith, and people who will put our faith in various things. And therefore, as we study science, we can't separate those things. And some of the discussion that we're having here, even as well, about Grosseteste and Aristotle and how these various ways that we think of science or scientia or scientific knowledge, they all relate together. And I think perhaps we have, in the modern world, made the mistake of trying to compartmentalize so much that we lose something when we do that. And what I like is Grosseteste, even though he is creating these 4 different ways about thinking about scientia, yet he has not gotten so compartmentalized that they don't relate at all to each other, but rather they do relate to each other and to some extent build on each other. And that was something that I really appreciated about that particular section on knowledge and science.
Thank you, my friend. We have one of the challenges to working through this that I think Pasnau helps us with is there is a cultural shift. So you and I reading about these medieval thinkers have to go through some degree of translation or explanation. Not only were they necessarily thinking in different language and living in a different time and culture, but they also didn't have the benefit of so much of the modern equipment that we do take for granted. I don't want to talk about modernity in solely negative fashions, but when we're trying to talk about these categories, we see that the appeal of Aristotle has largely, in these thinkers, diverged. Different people in different times and cultures have not been able to stretch the Aristotelian blanket to fit. And ultimately, like we've mentioned before, it's undergone a lot of patching and a lot of rework, and nobody's been able to quite make it work. And so we see the Aristotelian ideas and categories falling away, not necessarily at once, but over time. And with that falls away synthesis that ultimately didn't work. But that doesn't mean that the Aristotelian ideas didn't have any merit or didn't have any appeal or didn't have any value for trying to intuitively understand the problems that they were trying to face. And so we see a transition from the scholasticism of the medieval period to what is going to eventually be called the natural theology of the Renaissance and up to early modern period. And in some sense, natural theology is maybe a retrenchment. It's an acknowledgement that we tried to go down this path in the medieval thought, these ideas of Aristotle, and ultimately we couldn't get there from here. And now we're going to make this new start with natural theology. And then later on, of course, modernity is going to largely go to war with not only the scholasticism of Aristotle, but with many of the ideas of natural theology from this anti-supernatural point of view. And so we face the difficulty of being in a world today that has largely thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And that's a concern to me. When you think about the objects of knowledge, I think the study of Aristotle is very worthwhile. And the ideas that these medievals were thinking about. The same thing with certainty and what constitutes evidence. In some sense, even if Aristotle says nothing about certainty in, for example, his posterior analytics, you still have the thinkers coming up with the differences between what is plausible, between what is credible, and between what is certain. And so we have different modes of understanding knowledge. We still have those today, for example. So there's a good debate over, do we have knowledge if we can't scientifically demonstrate it? Some people will say no, some people will say yes, and that's a legacy of the thinkers here. So let me just give you the last word in here for this part of the chapter, building on that.
All right. And really, in the last part of the chapter, I think there was an interesting discussion about how do we get certainty and where does the evidence come from that certainty. And it is really interesting as well that we live in an era of skepticism. And there was a sense in that skepticism in the way that we think of it today wasn't present in the medieval era. And yet, in that last section, Pasnau does a nice job of walking through how various medieval thinkers thought through potential ways of thinking that maybe weren't the same as skepticism, but still addressed, can we truly know? And are there areas where some of our knowledge is contingent or some of our knowledge is less certain? And and talks about this idea of moral certainty that becomes popular later after the medieval times. He notes that it becomes very influential in the 17th century as a strategy for replying to skepticism. And then, of course, I think that relates a little bit to what you were saying, too, about how even natural theology grew up in sort of response to Aristotelianism, but even that has been displaced by modernism. And there's a sense, too, where modern skepticism has displaced even a desire to reply to skepticism, where skepticism becomes just as an appropriate response to how do we know things. And then that whole section is just interesting in how it applies evidence that we may have and where do we get certainty from and what level of evidence do we need to have. It's all just a really interesting thing. And again, as I keep pointing to, has an impact not only in how we think about science, but so much of the rest of thinking, including our ideas of faith, which again, in our very modern way of thinking, we tend to separate those things. And yet much of what we learn in this chapter applies even to how we think about faith. And it's just really, it's really intriguing. And this chapter really opened my eyes in a lot of ways to the fact that questions of faith can be thought through in some of these same ways, and that there is some benefit, some of the ways we think about science being applied to the ways that we think about faith, so long as we don't then buy into a modernistic, anti-theistic or anti-supernaturalist way of thinking and make those assumptions then as we walk through that way of thinking about certainty and evidence and those kinds of things. So thanks for walking through this with me. It's really been an interesting, very interesting walk through important and sometimes difficult paths of thinking, but also very useful.